So having been in classroom for a while, I can't help but start out classes with a quiz. Do you know what movie this is from?
Which one?
This little thing in the box.
Yes. It's from Princess Bride.
From The Princess Bride, yes. I thought of that when I was doing the Iliad, because the movie starts out, the book starts out with this grandson who just does not want to hear this story read by his grandfather. He decides to humor him by listening. And that was my experience when I started doing things like the Iliad with kids, too. They humored me, but then they got into the story. So despite the way it seems, classical education is not universally resisted. In fact, people tend to like the idea behind the grammar stage because it smacks them back to basics. And, most people think that is a good thing. It's when you get beyond that into like logic and rhetoric stages that then they get skeptical, because it's easy to see a practical purpose in the grammar stage, to learning multiplication tables and knowing what a noun is. The rest of it just seems so ivory tower. It's too academic. We don't want our schools to be academic. It's too ivory tower. And of course, that's the antithesis to practical. It's no good. And that's where, and skepticism sets in probably nowhere more firmly than when it comes to literature and the arts. So the idea behind reading a classic, that's very appealing for people. But at the same time, parents want their children's education to prepare them for something, to do something. And not to mention, no one relishes the idea of having their kids come home every day complaining about this stupid book they have to read, especially when mom and dad aren't sure why it should be read either. And even worse, when mom and dad don't read. So I got a lot of skeptical and worried looks when I told parents that their children would be reading the Iliad as part of the history class. And some just gave me funny looks. Others asked me why we would ever do that. So I said, well, that's a really good question. Let me tell you why. And first, we study it because the Iliad is a foundational story for Western literature. And we could spend a whole hour just talking about that. We're going to actually spend quite a bit talking about that. But suffice it to say, everyone who set out to tell a story about a hero and his journey, they owe some debt to Homer. In some way, they're just retelling what goes on in the Iliad and the Odyssey. I mean, it's so foundational, we don't even italicize. We don't even mark it as a regular book title. I mean, that's how important the Iliad is. There aren't many stories that get that. The Bible gets that treatment, the Odyssey gets it, and the Aeneid gets it. I mean, can you think of any other books where that happens? And that's how important it is. And secondly, it gives insight into Greek culture. You can tell a lot about people by the books and the literature they have. And so the Iliad was extremely popular among the Greeks. It was a very popular story, even among disparate cultures like Athens and Sparta. I mean, so you had these two, almost polar opposites, and yet they both loved this story. Why is that? By the way, that's one of the hallmarks of a classic, is that it has such a broad appeal to different cultures. And thirdly, the Iliad's a great way for introducing students to what we mean by when we talk about a classic, this is what we mean. And students, and often they have this reflex reaction to those words, a classic. They roll their eyes and they get ready to be bored because they've gotten the idea that classic means old and boring. But the Iliad's a great tool for teaching students that while classic works are often very old, they're old for a reason. They're old because they've stuck around for a while. They stick around for a while for a good reason too, because they continue to make, every time they come up, they make us think about things. And as we'll see, the themes in the Iliad they're very accessible to teenagers, and they make them think. And the other thing, I didn't put it down there, but the other thing is, when we do this, the other thing it does, it helps us set this idea aside that there's no such thing as good literature. Either you like it or you don't, right? So, and that's a very postmodern idea. And so it says there are these tools we can use to judge whether literature is good. Whether it's, there's literature, there's kind of the regular pot over here, but there's some that we've elevated to the status called classics. There's a reason for that. Now, I always tell kids, it doesn't mean that all the stuff in the other thing is bad. It's just not as good. The example that I use with them is a lot of times with music, because that's where that whole thing comes up too, that there's no such thing as good music or good art. There's what I like, and if you like something different, that's good too. And I said, well, there are some markers to tell what's good and what's bad, or what's not quite as good. So, I tell them, in school we study music, or, I'll go home, and I was in college and in seminary, I was in choirs, and so I'll go home and I'll listen to these choral pieces by Bach and such, and that's good music. And then I'll turn on the Go-Go's, which reminds me of being in high school. And I really like the Go-Go's, but by the time I'm dead, in 100 years, they're going to be gone. Nobody will remember them. Doesn't make that music evil or bad. Just that it's just not quite as good. So we can recognize that. Same thing with literature. We can say there are some things that they're classic for a reason. We'll see why that is. So when you're going to do this book, first you got to take some time to set the stage. Background information becomes especially important with the Iliad because we're thrust into the middle of what for most is an unfamiliar story. So you need to set that stage. You need to understand the culture in which the story is coming out of. So if in your school, if you've done ancient Greek culture, you can just quickly do a little review of that. I did it as part of a history class. And so it was part of it. And so we studied Greece and we read the Iliad at the same time. So if you're really savvy, you can even find some videos on YouTube that'll kind of get you through it. So when I started doing it, and that's important because they're kind of, they remember parts of the story that somehow filter to them, but they don't know all of it. And so I remember we were kind of introducing, going through it, and we finished a section, and I said, this really is where the Iliad ends. And the first question I got was, wait a minute, where's the horse? Well, it's not part of the story. It's a later part of the story. So, and that really, to review it, shouldn't take more than a day. And once you've done that, once you set the stage, you got to set the stage for the book itself, its background, its story, and the purpose of the story. And it's good to know about Homer and some of the authorship issues, but especially as important for students is knowing the main themes, and I list them there for you. Anger or rage, that's the big one. And glory, that is. Honor. Loyalty and love, and then fate is kind of a minor theme in the Iliad. Those last two, those get picked up later in other works. Because loyalty and love, that's the theme of the Odyssey. What does it mean to be loyal? And that, Odysseus is loyal. He wants to get back to his home. And his wife is loyal to Odysseus. And Odysseus' son is loyal to his father. That plays out there. And fate, that's the big theme in the Aeneid, that Aeneas doesn't matter what Aeneas tries to do, he's fated to found Rome. So you just might as well get with the program and do it. And something we'll keep coming back to is that the Iliad makes us think about these ideas in many different ways, even while it entertains us with story. That's the mark of classic literature, that we're entertained by the story, but at the same time, we're learning something, You should also, I remind students that whenever they got a question on a test about the Iliad, a good idea to ask themselves first is, which of these 5 themes does it maybe fit? Because that'll help me answer the question, and maybe even answer it right. So, I talk about this later, I don't remember where, but I had the kids kept a notebook, like a spiral notebook, and so I had them like on a page so on one page to write anger, rage. So then as we came across when this came up in the story, to stop and say, do you notice what just happened here? Write it down. And so, Achilles loses Briseis. So write that down. He's motivated now by rage to do this. And so they have an example of it. So that helped them kind of keep things straight in their mind. And then finally, you want to learn the story of the Trojan War, because the Iliad doesn't tell it. It just tells part of it. It tells us tells the last year of the war and doesn't even finish the war for us. But it assumes that you know the story. So It's kind of like, so before you study the Iliad, you need to study the war. And so for kids, you can tell them it's kind of like this. It'd be kind of like me taking you. You're a new person, and you've never seen this before, and I take you to go see, in Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, which assumes you know who all the characters are and what their motivations are. But you're new to the story, so you need to know all the background. Or in Lord of the Rings, if you just watch the Two Towers, that's, it assumes that you know who these people are and what they're doing, but in the Iliad, most of us don't. So, a great resource for this, and I am so sorry I did not bring it. I forgot to. It's called Black Ships Before Troy. Do any of you have that book? Yeah, that is such a great book. It is so much fun. It's done by a woman named Rosemary Sutcliffe, who takes the whole story of the Trojan War from the beginning of it to the end. Has these the big version has these beautiful illustrations by Alan Lee, and Alan Lee is the guy. If you go into a bookstore and you find a nice edition of The Lord of the Rings, Alan Lee did the illustrations. Just wonderful. So, Black Ships is a great book. Unfortunately, if you want to get it, you have to order it. However, there are 2 editions of this book. Do you know that? Yeah, I did not know that. You know what happened to me? What I did was in class, in history, I took the book, I marked, I said I'm going to take this many days to cover Greece. Right. So then I divided the book into a slightly fewer portions. And I read at the beginning of the class, I say, okay, let's just start reading. We started reading the book, which was, I probably make this point later, but it's a good thing to do to junior high kids, to read to them. They love it. They do. They just think it's, I went to public university for education. My reading professor said, you've got to do that with kids. You've got to read to them. So we read through this, and I noticed one girl, actually kind of like over there, and she was always looking down, and she had gone to the library, and she had gotten the book. And so she had gotten that, and then she got the little edition without the pictures, right? So she could read along, Now, if I was doing it again, what I would really like to do is get one of those for all. I would make them buy it. I would just make it as part. You're taking this class, you're going to buy this book, and part of that is because the kids got into the story, but it gives them something to look back at. Right. So I read it to them. Poetry is meant to be read out loud anyway, So, and then after a while, you can assign sections of the book for kids to read, but read it to them. We start by reading it to them. Let them get into the story. And they do get into it. Because the Trojan War is one big soap opera. And it has lots of characters. And they're dealing with things like anger and love and being manipulated and loyalty and death. And students latch onto those things really fast. They get it. Because, you think about it, what teenager doesn't want the attention of the most beautiful girl, the prettiest girl in the school? And that's Paris and Helen. Or, what girl doesn't want the attention of the cutest boy? Or what teenager doesn't feel like sometimes they're underappreciated and they get angry because of it? Or hasn't wanted revenge? Or hasn't felt like they were forced to do something by their parents? Or weren't in control of their destiny? And that's, these are themes in the Iliad that keep coming up. And so once in a while I would stop. We'd be reading about something and I would stop and ask a question. And it's really fun. And the fun part about it is, of course, the kids kind of know the story, but they haven't read it. And so, you're reading through the section with Paris and the golden apple, and the goddesses come and say, and they say, pick one of us, and, we'll each give you a prize. And you stop and you say, so which one do you pick? So you have Hera offering you one thing. You have Venus Aphrodite offering you, the most beautiful girl in the world. You have Athena offering you wisdom. Which one do you pick? And you watch these good Lutheran boys stand up and, of course I would pick wisdom or something. What big liars you are. No, of course not. You're all right there with Paris saying, I could be really rich, I could be really, really smart, or I could be with the most beautiful girl in the world. And, of course, so we talk, which one does Paris pick? He picks the girl, and all the trouble starts there. So, but But that's good, because now what you're doing is or you stop and you ask questions about what's going on here, and you get them talking about that, and they love to talk about that. So the same notebook, I would have them keep notes. That's what we'd ask, sometimes I would stop and I would say, what theme of the Iliad are we talking about right now? And you would ask a child and they would tell you which one this was. Also in that, they kept a list of characters, because the cast of characters gets pretty large. So you had Greeks, Trojans, gods for the Greeks, gods for the Trojans. And so they would keep this list of these people, so they kind of knew who was who. Another way to do it would be to assign everybody a character and say, I want you to keep track of everything Achilles does, you keep track of everything Patroclus does, and you keep track of Zeus, and you keep track of Apollo. And that's good too. Now, because I did this in history, I did not give homework with the Iliad so much. In a literature class, you would. But I told them, anything I read, that's fair game. So on a test, I might ask about it. No, I also told them, I'm not going to ask you, what color sandals somebody was wearing. Yeah. But, why? But I will ask you, why does this person take this sort of action? So, and then once we got through the black ships, then the good news is they're ready for the real thing. The bad news is you're now in a dilemma, because there are lots of good public domain. There are lots of free translations of the Iliad. Unfortunately, they are all, for the most part, they're older, and they're poetic. And so, they're readable, but for teenagers, it's kind of tough. There's lots of good modern translations, but you have to pay for those. So in descending order, these are the ones that I like. And the one I like the best is this one by this guy named Stanley Lombardo. And he's done the Odyssey, the Iliad, and the Aeneid. He just started, I guess, doing Dante now. So his edition of Inferno is coming out. The really cool thing about the Lombardo ones, first, is that the covers are so cool. So I can't tell what this one is. This is D-Day. That's kind of cool. That the D-Day invasion for the Iliad. That makes sense. And the one for Odyssey is the picture. I got a friend of mine, another pastor, who was reading it. Here, look at this, and then I'll make some comments about Stanley. But the one for Odyssey is a picture from the Odyssey, from the Apollo 8. And so my friend of mine, he was looking at it, and he said, yeah, I really like the cover on that, because, it shows it's a journey, you're taking a journey. He said, no, I didn't say you idiot. I said, no, the capsule is named the Odyssey, so there's kind of a double entendre there. And now I can't remember what the Aeneid is a picture of the Vietnam Veterans Wall. It makes sense, too, because the Aeneid's themes. So Lombardo is really good. I think he manages to force Homer to speak English. It's very poetic, but it feels like the Iliad. So I really like Lombardo. The word bitch comes up once or twice. It's well used. But it's and for teenagers that might not be the best. But Lombardo also has it's an edition that only has certain books of the Iliad. So it's not abridged, but he just takes book 1 and 3 and 8 and 16 and just does those. So that might work also. But I'm a big fan of that one. Fagles is another good one, but in some ways it's kind of what you like, and I like Lombardo better than Fagles. Lattimore is kind of the standard translation. He's pretty good, but I think it's starting to show its age. Hammond, that's a prose translation. It looks like a novel, and I don't like that. I like to see it in poetry form, but it's a good translation. So if you like it better, go for it. Fitzgerald's probably the most common translation. So, but I think he's stilted. Some people think Fitzgerald is poetic. In some ways he is, but it just is stilted. And plus, he's one of those academics that he doesn't say Achilles. He says Achilles. I mean, that's how he writes it out. And so, or the Italians rather than the Greeks. So Lombardo he gives the anglicized version of it, which I think is easy. And my footnote there: if you really want to take the plunge, if you're homeschooling and you've done a little bit of Koine Greek, or if you happen to have Koine at your school, the Iliad's actually fairly easy Greek. It's easier than many parts in the New Testament. The challenge in the Iliad is vocabulary. I mean, how many words for stabbing can you have? Yes. But there are a lot, as you find out. But it's, there are these short sentences. Homer doesn't mess around with hiding the verb, way, 17 words off. It's these nice, short little things. And so the Greek is actually pretty easy, but you better have a dictionary with you, and it better not be the one you have in the New Testament, because for some reason John and St. Paul don't have all those words for spear and such. So now I'm not even optimistic enough to try the whole Iliad in junior high. You might try it in high school,
right.
But so you got to pick out the points you want to do, and so these are the ones. If you're on limited time, here are the ones I would suggest. The ones that are asterisk are the ones you've just got to do. So book 1, that introduces the poem, sets forth all the major themes, it details the dispute between Agamemnon and Achilles, and it's easy to read. It's easy to understand and enjoy. I read it out, or most of it out loud to the kids. And, once they'd done Black Ships, they understood, they knew what was going on. And book 2 is good. Book 2 is really good because it shows the armies getting ready for war, and Zeus comes and lies about an easy victory to Agamemnon. And then the second part of book 2 is the catalog of troops, and that's just a great set. It's long and boring, and you would not make children read that. They should read part of it because it's so fun to do it with them. You start reading through the catalog of ships, and you ask them, "What do you think?" And they'll kind of nod. That's all right. What do you really think? Well, that's boring. And then you tell them, that's the part all the Greeks were just in rapt attention to, is listening to the catalog of ships, because you're waiting to hear the name of your ancestors say, "That's right. I'm connected to that person." So it's an interesting thing to kind of show a very cultural thing, to kind of look for that. So for them, that was great stuff, but we skip it. So 3 introduces Paris in the Aeneid, or I'm sorry, in the Iliad. He goes by Alexandros sometimes, and so you get a little peek. We get a little glimmer of why we're all fighting. Book 6. Book 6, sometimes it's skipped, but I think it's good to read because it has the girls in it. Mm-hmm. So you have Hector. Hector goes home after some fighting, and he talks to his wife, Andromache. So they have a nice, touching scene there. Hector talks about his duty to fight and talks to his wife, and you have Helen there and Hector's mom, and Hector gets Paris to go fight again. So it's it kind of gives the perspective of the women. And book 9 is important. You have the Greeks, Odysseus and Phoenix and Ajax. There's 2 Ajaxes, so you got to keep them straight. To go try to get Achilles to come back to the fight, and Achilles tells him he's not going back. He's taking his ball and he's going home. Book 11 has you have all these Greek guys getting wounded, and they're coming out of the battle, and then you have in 12, 13, 14, and 15 there's all this fighting, and then book 16, that's when Troy breaks through. They make it to the ships. Patroclus goes to Achilles and says, "You've got to at least let me wear your armor to fight." And Achilles says, "Okay, go ahead, but don't get close to the walls of Troy." So. And then you get to teach the children what foreshadowing means. So, and then book 18. I don't have an asterisk, but that's and of course at the end of 16, Patroclus gets killed. And then in book 18, I don't have an asterisk, but even if you don't do the rest of it, you should read the part about the shield of Achilles. It's just a great section. I had the kids read that on their own. So they should. At the end of the book, the shield being made for Achilles is really good. There's lots of good questions with that too, because you start, one of the extra credit projects I gave to students was to design the shield, to read the section out of the Iliad, and now make it. Show me the picture. And so that's a good activity. And then you ask them, why are all these, you're right, you've got this shield, which you use for fighting. Well, why are all these scenes about farming in the home on here? What's that about? You know, these towns and these oxen, you know, plowing the fields. You know, it just seems kind of strange that you would do that. 18, by the way, also has, there's one of my favorite quotes from the Iliad is in book 18. It's Achilles talking about anger. You know, anger is this thing that you swallow and it makes you think you're filled up, but it's like smoke in the belly. It doesn't really fill you up. It causes more trouble. Book 19, Achilles makes peace with Agamemnon. They become friends again. And then Achilles, and then there's a little bit of foreshadowing about Achilles' death. Book 22 is the death of Hector. And then book 23, you got the funeral rites for Patroclus and also the games. And then in book 24, Priam comes to get Hector's body, and Achilles he's finally able to let go of his anger. And so the asterisk books are the ones that I just think are really important for kids. If they're going to read it, they've got to read those books at least. And give yourself at least 2 weeks to get through the book. And again, you'll want to spend time reading the poem aloud. If for no other reason, then you can read stuff like this section, you know, in 16, where it says, Idomeneus plugged Eramus's mouth with cruel bronze, the spear point passing beneath the brain pan, shattering all the bones. His teeth rattled out, his eyes filled with blood, and he spurted blood out through his nostrils and gaping mouth until death's black nimbus enveloped him. And all of a sudden you have every 13-year-old boy going, you know, no one told us it was going to be like that. But that's great. I love those passages in there. Because then again, it plays this really dirty trick on them. And then you ask them, why do you think the Iliad is so graphic in its descriptions of the battles? So is it because, is it to highlight the heroism of someone like Idomeneus? Or is it to try and show the horror of war? And the Iliad's really good. I mean, it's hard to read it. And, you know, you can read it both ways, the whole thing. And all of a sudden, you've got 13-year-old boys discussing these literary themes about how war is depicted. Or is there such thing as a good war? You know, suddenly at least I found myself in this bizarro world where the bell rings and these kids are walking out talking about classic literature and continuing these arguments out the door. So, you know, they're talking about, you know, what Achilles should have done, the rage of Achilles and all this, and really you've got to say to them, you're not supposed to talk in the hallways, but, you know, you don't want to. And they're all over the Iliad. I mean, as teachers, you'll find them, but, you know, these are some of the questions I made them ask, you know. Like Achilles, there's a lot of things out of anger or rage. Every time this happens, it is good to stop and ask if he's justified in what he's doing. So is Achilles an instrument of justice? Is he doing a good thing but taking it too far? Is he a big baby whose feelings are too easily hurt? Or is he a hot-headed jerk? Yeah, well, yeah. But then you start asking kids, you know, which one? Tell me which one. Just pick one. And that's always fun. And, you know, the other reason I love the Iliad is because I ask kids questions like, you know, really, have you ever been in a situation where you're arguing with your parents and your mom, you're kind of you're almost yelling, maybe you are yelling, and then your mom or dad says, you say one more word, and you're grounded for a month, or your Xbox is taken away, and says, what do you do? That's right, you say the word. Why? Because you're angry. You know, welcome to the world of Achilles, right? Well, that's good. Now we understand what this thing is about, right? Rage, you know. So that's a good. So now they connect. And they say, well, yeah, I get that. Or, you know, Achilles does a lot of things out of anger or rage. Is anger always a bad thing? Can anger ever motivate us to right actions? And this idea of right actions is a really Greek concept too. So.
I think we connect that to Jesus too.
Yes. Oh, now we're connecting to the Bible. Yeah. Yeah, isn't that good? Now we've gone, now they get to bring that into this a little bit, isn't it? And that's good because now they understand that, anger is we generally think of it as a bad thing. Can it never motivate us to good? Yeah, and that's an excellent, that's where you want to take the discussion. Yeah. Isn't there a Bible story about Jesus getting angry? So is Jesus doing something wrong there? So is Jesus like Achilles? No. There's something different. By the way, now this is completely off the Iliad, but Professor Nordling, he's talking about doing stuff with Greek and how important that is. That the example, when Jesus gets mad, when Jesus cleanses the temple, that's where you want your pastor to know Greek. Because Jesus cleanses the temple, and what does he do? He takes a whip and he drives out, the money changers and the oxen. When you read it in Greek, you can tell Jesus is using the whip on the cattle, not the money changers. So it's not Jesus, beating on these guys because they're not clearing out. He's using the whip to drive the cattle. And you can tell that in Greek. It's hard to see that in English. So. But I always make that point because the anger thing comes up, and if Jesus can beat people with a whip, why can't I? Except he didn't. Or Achilles is given a choice between long life with no fame or short life with great fame. Which one's better? Or what kind of person is Helen? Would it be a compliment for someone to say, "You're just like Helen"? Or for the boys, is Helen the kind of person you want to marry? Is there a message about true beauty in the Iliad? Or are Helen and Paris in love? Or who's more heroic in the Iliad, Achilles or Hector? Or who are the good guys in the Iliad, the Greeks or the Trojans? So that started a fight in my class. But I was just amazed though that you had kids that you know this probably better than I do, but how smart kids can be, how they kind of perceive these things. And, the Iliad spends almost all its time with the Greeks. And yet, a lot of kids figured out, the Trojans, the Trojans are defending their town. Achilles is fighting for glory, and Hector is fighting to defend his family. Who are the good guys here? But there's other things going on, of course, but it's just amazing that they figured this out. Now, you might, a lot of these ask very black and white questions. And teens see things in black. It's right or it's wrong, right? But one of the things you want to do now, they're kind of, especially in a rhetoric stage, or they're kind of moving out of logic into rhetoric. Now's the time to move them into shades of gray. To say, there are some answers that there's no right. There are some questions to which there's no right answer. What happens now is, the question you want to ask is, how are you going to defend that answer? Right. And now, my little disclaimer, of course, I'm not talking about moral relativism. But, to ask, who's more heroic, Achilles or Hector? Well, give me your answer. I'll tell you if it's a good one or not. And, that's an opportunity for them to give their opinion. But it becomes more than their opinion. It's their opinion based on what they've read. And so, it's not just, well, I like Hector better. Well, that's not enough. Give me an example of what he does that's better than what Achilles does. So,
I think it's such a wrong answer that's defending.
Right.
Yes.
Than a right answer that's not.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's where you want those kids to move toward, is to actually think about it. And the other thing that of course, then what they get to do is they learn how to discuss things with each other. To have a child stand up and because I would ask them a question like, is it a compliment? Would it be a compliment for me to say to one of the girls, "You're just like Helen"? I had a Helen in my class that semester, and it was just, I felt so sorry for her. I had to keep myself from picking on her, because Helen is called Helen of the Fair Eyes in the Iliad. Helen has the nice eyes. And so I would tease her once in a while, but I had to be really careful that I didn't overdo it. But she was the one, by the way, that went out and got the copy of the Iliad to read with me, read along. So, but you have, you know, is this a compliment? Who thinks it's a compliment when you have them stand up? And you know, why? Why do you think that? Well, you didn't stand up. Do you think it's not a compliment? Why not? And they could get them to talk back and forth. And then they learn that you know, we can have a debate, but you better be able to back up your opinion with some ideas back here. So, then the concept of the hero, that comes out in the Iliad. That's important too. And it's important to touch upon because it's one of the reasons the Iliad becomes so foundational. There's a lot, you just start talking, you type the hero in Google and you'll find all sorts of resources for it. But the idea you want to discuss is that the hero is a person with extraordinary abilities, but then he also has a flaw. He makes a journey, encounters a crisis, overcomes or disciplines his flaw, thus growing and becoming the better for it. Right? Now, the best way to do this is to wait till you finish you should finish Black Ships first. You probably should finish the Iliad also and talk about this afterward. And then you start asking them questions like, then you start showing how this theme keeps coming up in modern literature and in stories that they've read. And so we were talking about these things. We did this with mythology too. Said, gosh, you've got these people, these gods. They have, they each kind of have this one quality they're known for. Can you think of any stories today about a group of people with extraordinary abilities that generally use them for good, but they're always flawed somehow? And then you watch the light go on. Because the teens were really good about this, but you know what they made the connection? You know who they made the connection to? Who the new mythology is? Star Wars that's gonna come up next. But I said, well, what movies have you gone to go see? Spider-Man, Superman, Batman. And then you start showing them some things. Well, who are Spider-Man's parents? Do you know? They're dead. Yeah. Who are Superman's parents? They're dead. Who are Dorothy's parents from The Wizard of Oz? They're dead. Yeah, Luke Skywalker. Yeah, or if you have to use Anakin, you can use Anakin too. Ooh. There's some connection. Then you start asking about, well, what are some other movies you like that you watch? And where are these people's parents? Who raises them? They have special ability, almost magical ability. They have friends that go along with them to help them out. And it was one of the moments you just watch it, the light goes on. Yeah, that's right. Hey. And then, now, suddenly, they have a tool. It's one of the ways they can evaluate good literature. So now, so what makes Star Wars, now they see Star Wars and they see it in a whole new light that, wow, this is retelling a story like the Iliad. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it is. So, and what's different, and it allows them to critique things now and say, this is what makes this story good, and makes this one maybe not so good. This is why the Iliad, or the other fun thing to do with them is, especially with boys, you can do it with the girls somewhat, to ask the boys, tell me what TV show you watched all the time when you were 6, 7. And I never remember what they tell me, but like Power Rangers. Oh yeah, tell me what happens in Power Rangers. And I said, I can tell you what happens. You've got this group of people, they go and fight this person, they get beat, they have to come back, regroup, they go and fight again and they win, right? So there's this, the story gets told over and over, and it's fun and it's entertaining when you're 7, but after a while it kind of loses its appeal. Why? Because it's not that good a story. It's fun to watch, and doesn't make it evil, and so it doesn't mean you're all, worshiping the devil when you watch Power Rangers, but it's just not as good. Right. Now they begin to recognize that, and why don't you watch it anymore? You've grown up. You need better stories to read, like the Iliad, and that was one of the other things that was just a bizarre moment to, I'd never had to do this before. And this is just one of those things to talk about teaching classically and what it means, is that. I did this thing, and I didn't even mean it as a reverse psychology thing. I said, we're going to read parts of the Iliad, I said, frankly, some parts are long, and you would probably find them boring. I will read parts out loud to you that I think are exciting, and, that'll do that. And of course, then you have this line of, these students coming up and saying, well, where can I get a copy of this? I suppose if you must go out and buy the Iliad, here's one I would get. And they actually did. You'd see these students looking through it and reading it. It's bizarre. But what had happened is it's the difference between just giving the book and say, here, read this, and you have a report due on it in 2 weeks. And kind of introducing it to them and leading them into the story. And they find out that this is a great thing. And these are stories that are worthy of them. It's different than, it's different than the pokey little puppy. So, which again, it's not saying that those are the ones they read in first grade are bad. So now you're growing up. Here are the stories that are really kind of worthy of who you are now. But here's the reason, what I think is the most important reason for doing this and for reading classics and why I like the Iliad so much. So I had just finished the section of Black Ships where Achilles gives Patroclus permission to wear his armor. It's book 16. So I set the book down because I didn't want to kill Patroclus quite yet, and I had other stuff I wanted to do. And one of the boys just said, this is such a sad story. And it wasn't unusual for that boy to talk without being called on, but instead of disciplining him, I said, well, why do you say that? And he just started talking about, not Paris who does this thing just to satisfy. He didn't say satisfy his lust. He just does this to, because he likes this girl and he doesn't, and she runs away. They don't think about how this affects other people. And then you got Achilles, and they're both so proud they won't back down to each other, but yet it's hurting all their friends. And should they know better, and don't they care how these actions hurt the people around them? And it becomes one of those great moments where you just kind of, the other kids start to talk about stuff, and you just kind of set the lesson aside. Because now what they figured out is this is why things are classic. Because now we have discussion about sinful, selfish behavior brings sadness to our lives, and the lives of people around us. And so all of a sudden, so now we start talking about the Iliad, but we're really not talking about the Iliad anymore. You have kids saying things like, what about when people do things like what Achilles does, and they do this kind of thing, and as a teacher, when they're, what if you had a friend who was doing this, but they had a safe place to talk about it. They didn't have to come out and say, well, my dad once did this thing. You can say, like when Achilles does this, isn't that a bad thing? If somebody gets angry and they don't think about how this affects other people, that's just an opportunity that you can't waste. And just nice, safe environment to discuss these things and talk about them. And then I tell them that's why the Iliad's a classic. It's 3,000 years old, but yet it's still relevant. We're still it brings up these things. We're still talking about them, and that's why we do that. Because we're not, we're a lot less interested in teaching Greek culture than we are in teaching students, and that's what those books do. They teach students. We talk about themes, like what it means to be, like the themes of anger and what that means, and it gives them a nice arena to discuss these ideas and say, well, you would never get angry and do that, would you? Well, yeah, I guess I would. So in a Christian school, then you get to talk about repentance and how that affects things, and how Achilles really should have dealt with his little problem there. So on the back of it, I have a little bibliography. Because of alphabetizing, I should have brought a copy of this too. The first one there is really one you should look up, called The Hysterical History of the Trojan War. My daughter, who was not in my class, did this play, and it's really good. It's just, if you're familiar with the Trojan War, you start reading through it and you just laugh and laugh because it's funny. But whoever wrote that play knew the Iliad. I mean, they just make so many funny things in there. So you can look at that. I have the Lombardo for the Iliad, so you can find that. And then this Colleen McCulloch book. Do you know who she is? She wrote The Thornbirds. She also wrote just a masterful, I think it's a 7-volume, called Masters of Rome series. It's really good. If you want the history of Rome from about 100 BC to 44, the death of Caesar and the rise of Augustus, it's just great. Don't assign it to your students. It's at least NC 17, but for you it'd be good stuff. It's just, it really, not only that, the best part of the McCulloch books is that, and she does this in The Song of Troy too, but the book ends, and there's still about, this much of the book left. Those are her notes. So she says, so in other words, what she does is, and her bibliographies, and she says, it's fiction, but it's not like she makes this up all over her head. She said, here are the books that I read, here's my glossary of Latin terms that, so she goes through and she defends a lot of the choices she makes. She did such a good job, they ended up giving her a PhD in classics for writing those books. Yeah, because people read them and said, gosh, this woman taught herself to read Latin. She read these Latin authors, stuff. She would read stuff like Tacitus and Caesar's commentaries. She comes up, she'd say, here's why I did these things that I did, and they ended up giving her I hesitate to call it an honorary doctorate because it was really well done. The Song of Troy one is really good. If you know the story of the Trojan War, it's fun to read because she demythologizes it. She tells it without, what she's trying to do is tell a story of what might have really happened that gave rise to the story. And so there are no gods in it, no goddesses. The most interesting part of the book, or the part that got my attention, is she talked about how the whole thing between Achilles and Agamemnon was a big show to fool the Trojans. And anyway, I wish there was a G version of it because it'd be great to give that to kids and say, what do you think? What do you think of the approach she took? The Sutcliffe, Rosemary Sutcliffe, Black Ship Before Troy is just indispensable. It's such a good book. There are two other books that are kind of part of it. The next one is called The Odyssey, which retells the story of the Odyssey. The other one's for the Aeneid called In Search of a Homeland. And once again, both times, the first one I saw was the one for the Aeneid, and I'm just reading it, and it just, because I'm probably one of the only people, I went to public school, and that's where I had my Latin. I had Latin in my public school, so we got to read parts of the Aeneid. And I'm reading it, and it reads like the Aeneid. I couldn't put it down, because I was just amazed what a good job she had done. Making Virgil speak English. So anyway, it covers the whole war. Kids loved it. They just got into that book. So that Phyllis Taylor one, I stole a lot from her. That's a really good site if you want to teach the Iliad. The videos, you can find that on YouTube, The Greeks' Crucible of Civilization. That's good. Then I have that movie Troy, directed by Wolfgang Peterson with Brad Pitt as Achilles, which let me put there to warn you off, because it's a great example of what happens when you decide to fix a classic. So they do some things in there to make the story better, and it just is messes it up. The Ten Commandments is a better representation of Exodus than Troy is of the Iliad. So, and plus, I believe it or not, I actually have some respect for Brad Pitt as an actor. I think he's pretty good, but he's a terrible Achilles. He's just, he just doesn't have it for that part. And those other two websites are quite good. They have some neat things for teaching it. So, anyway, do you have any questions or anecdotes or comments about doing this yourself? By the way, now I got to make my pitch. If anybody wants this copy of the Lombardo translation, I will sell it to you for $10. Because what happened was, I was getting ready to come. I should have brought my copy of Lombardo with me, and I didn't, with my Sutcliffe. And so I'm driving down to the conference, and I stop in Kansas City at Barnes & Noble, and wouldn't you know it, they had a copy of this. And so I had to bring it for no other reason. I got to find the thing about anger in here. So it's a great. It really is my favorite translation of all of them. Let me find the anger quote for you. I didn't dare mark anything in this book, though. Oh, no wonder I'm looking at book 16. It's supposed to be in book 18. Gotta get Patrick was dead before. Yeah, here goes. Yeah, this is so great. Where Achilles, what happens is Thetis, Achilles' mother. That's the other thing kids ask. So Achilles is still alive at the end of the book. What happened? I said, well, they haven't killed him off yet. So Thetis comes to kind of comfort him because Patroclus is dead, and Achilles is just beginning to figure out that, why is Patroclus dead? Because he was a big jerk and too stubborn to fight. If he would have been fighting, Patroclus might still be alive. So whose fault is this? It's Achilles' fault. He's starting to figure it out. And so he says, I wish all strife could stop among gods and among men, and anger too. He says, anger sends sensible men into fits of temper. It drips down our throats sweeter than honey and mushrooms up in our bellies like smoke. It's sweet going down. Revenge is just so nice when you're doing it. But what does it leave you with? It's like smoke in your belly. And that's the kind of quote you read to the kids and say, so do you understand what that's saying? It's good. Go ahead, I'm sorry, I interrupted you before.
Have you heard of Mary Osborne's children's versions? Have you heard anything?
No, those I haven't seen. So, probably I like the Sutcliffe one so bad.
What age is the Sutcliffe one?
Oh, I gave it to my daughter when she was 7 or 8.
Okay, so because I was thinking for teaching this for history,
Yeah.
or get into the history part, it would be, I think it would become like second grade, third grade.
Yeah.
I can't remember where it falls in
And
history.
the text in it, the text isn't quite, well, maybe third grade. Maybe the third grade is a good reader. They can get through it.
But if she's reading it out loud.
Oh, but the pictures are just beautiful.
Well, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of book, and I'm sure that you don't have any, I'm sure none of your children are like this. My daughter is very stubborn. So if I say to her, here's a book you should read, that thing will sit on the table forever. Right? If I just lay it down there, she'll start to look through it. And that's one that she would just start looking through it, and look at the pictures. And then, they did this play about Troy, and she got to be Athena in the play. And so then she wanted to look at the book to see what's Athena dressed like. Those books are just so good. And to this day, I just cannot figure out. I go to Barnes and Noble and I find this right away. Yeah, but I can never find the Sutcliffe books. They're never there. And there's such, it's not like, it's not like they're bloody or anything. It's not like they're. Again, it's the kind of thing I would leave out in a classroom. It's not going to bother children. Of course, talking to teachers in schools where you teach the sacrifice of Isaac, but at the same time, they're not that, the kind of books that they just engage children. So, apparently Rosemary Sutcliffe is involved in a lot. I was talking to a friend of mine where he said, and as soon as I mentioned her name, he said, oh, she did this thing on these other things too, and I used to read about her when I was little, and so apparently she's really into this movement of taking classic works of literature and making them accessible for younger children. So. Oh, I guess it's almost time. Yeah, I should let you all go. So, well, thanks. Yeah. Okay, go home and read the Iliad. It's really good.